A 73-year-old woman stood at a supermarket checkout, $4 short for groceries. Behind her in line stood the millionaire whose children she raised for 15 years. Their eyes met. He looked away and pretended he didn't know her. But then his 7-year-old son said 5 words that would change everything. "Daddy, isn't that Miss Ellie?" What happened next exposed a secret that had been buried for 7 years, a secret about a child everyone thought was dead. This is a true story about shame, redemption, and the day a forgotten nanny brought a powerful family to its knees. Stay with me, because the ending will leave you speechless. Welcome to Penthouse Stories with Grandpa. While you are here, please hit the subscribe button and share your thoughts on the story, as well as where you are watching from. You know, sometimes life has a way of bringing us face to face with our own shame. And when it happens, it doesn't whisper. It shouts. This is a story about one of those moments, a moment that happened in the most ordinary place you can imagine. A grocery store in downtown Chicago on a cold Tuesday afternoon. Picture this scene with me. The automatic doors slide open, the fluorescent lights buzz overhead, and shoppers push their carts down aisles filled with everyday things. Bread, milk, cereal. Nothing special, just another day. But for one woman standing at the checkout counter, this was about to become the longest day of her life. Her name was Miss Eleanor Washington, though everyone who knew her just called her Miss Ellie. She was 73 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a simple bun and hands that had worked hard for decades. Those hands were trembling now as she stood there, counting out wrinkled dollar bills and loose change from her worn leather purse. The cashier, a young woman with bright pink nails, called out the total. $32.47. Miss Ellie counted again. $28. She was $4 short. $4 that might as well have been $400. You'll need to remove some items, the cashier said, her voice already tired and impatient. Miss Ellie nodded quickly, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. Yes, of course, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the beeping scanners and music playing overhead. She reached into her basket with shaking hands. A small carton of milk came out first, then a box of tea bags. Her fingers hesitated over the loaf of bread, but she left it. Bread she needed. Tea she could live without. The line behind her was growing. People shifted their weight from foot to foot. Someone sighed loudly. Miss Ellie felt their impatience like heat on her back, but what could she do? This was her reality now. Counting pennies. Making impossible choices between butter and eggs. And that's when she saw him. Not because he made any sound. Not because he called her name. But because when you've known someone, really known them, you feel their presence even before you see their face. Standing just 3 people back in line was Jonathan Reed. Mr. Jonathan Reed, actually. The millionaire whose face smiled from billboards across the city. Tall, confident, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Miss Ellie's entire month's rent. His watch caught the supermarket lights, flashing gold. Their eyes met for just a fraction of a second. Miss Ellie's breath caught in her throat. Recognition flooded through her like electricity. This was the man whose children she had raised. This was the man whose house she had kept for 15 years. This was the man who, when he let her go 5 years ago, had promised she would always be part of the family. And now here he stood, looking at her like she was a complete stranger. Miss Ellie wanted to speak. She wanted to say his name. But the words stuck in her throat like broken glass. Because something in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. He was pretending. Pretending he didn't recognize her. Pretending she was invisible. The shame that washed over her in that moment was worse than being unable to pay for groceries. It was the shame of being forgotten, of being erased, of being nothing. She turned back to the cashier, blinking hard to keep tears from falling. "Just the bread and the rice, please," she said quietly. The cashier rang up the 2 items. Miss Ellie counted out her money with fingers that wouldn't stop shaking. Behind her, she could hear whispers starting. "Isn't that Miss Ellie?" From the Reed mansion. "Oh my God, I think it is. Look at her. She can't even afford groceries. That's so sad. I heard the Reeds just bought a vacation home in Aspen." The whispers felt like needles. Miss Ellie took her small plastic bag, the one that held only bread and rice, and turned to leave. She kept her eyes down, looking at the scuffed tile floor, not wanting to see Jonathan Reed's face again. Not wanting to see him looking through her like she was made of glass. But then, cutting through all the noise and whispers and beeping checkout scanners, came a child's voice. Clear and innocent and impossibly loud. "Daddy, isn't that Miss Ellie?" The entire supermarket seemed to stop breathing. Miss Ellie froze mid-step. The cashier's hand paused over the scanner. Even the background music seemed to fade away. The voice belonged to a little boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, holding onto Jonathan Reed's hand. The boy's eyes were wide and bright with recognition. "Daddy," the boy said again, louder this time, tugging on his father's sleeve. "That's Miss Ellie, the lady who used to sing me to sleep when I had nightmares. Why aren't you saying hello?" You could have heard a pin drop in that supermarket. Every eye turned from the little boy to Jonathan Reed, then to Miss Ellie, then back again. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Jonathan Reed's face had gone pale. His jaw was clenched so tight you could see the muscles working. His hand, the one his son wasn't holding, had curled into a fist at his side. And Miss Ellie, still frozen by the exit, felt something crack open inside her chest. Not hope exactly. She was too tired for hope. But something small and fragile that whispered, maybe he remembers after all. The question hung in the air like smoke. What would Jonathan Reed do now? Would he keep pretending? Or would he finally tell the truth? Let me tell you something about moments of truth. They don't come when you're ready. They come when you're exposed, when the whole world is watching, when there's no place left to hide. And that's exactly where Jonathan Reed found himself, standing in a Chicago supermarket with his son's innocent question echoing in the air like an accusation. "Daddy, why aren't you saying hello?" The seconds stretched out like hours. You know that feeling when time seems to slow down right before something important happens. That's what this was. Jonathan Reed stood there, his expensive suit suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. His throat worked, trying to swallow, but his mouth had gone dry. Around them, phones started coming out of pockets. In today's world, you know how it goes. Someone sees something interesting, something dramatic, and within seconds it's being recorded, uploaded, shared. This was no different. 3, 4, 5 phones were already pointed at the scene, their red recording lights blinking like tiny accusers. Miss Ellie wanted to disappear. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. But her feet wouldn't move. Maybe it was shock. Maybe it was something else. Maybe, after 5 years of silence, some part of her needed to see what he would do. Jonathan Reed finally moved. He took one step forward, then stopped. Took another step, then stopped again. It was like watching a man walk through deep water, every movement a struggle against something invisible but heavy. "Miss Ellie," he said, and his voice came out rough and low, like he hadn't used it in a long time. Those 2 words, her name spoken out loud, hit her like a physical thing. Her shoulders started to shake. She gripped her plastic bag tighter, the one with just bread and rice inside, and finally turned to face him fully. The supermarket had gone completely silent now. Everyone was watching. The young mother with 2 kids in her cart. The college student with earbuds hanging around his neck. The elderly man buying cat food. All of them frozen, witnessing something that felt important, even if they didn't know the whole story yet. "Yes, sir," Miss Ellie said quietly, and that single word, "sir," told everyone everything they needed to know about their relationship. Even now, even after everything, she still saw herself as the help. Jonathan Reed flinched like the word had slapped him. His eyes looked shiny now, and it wasn't from the harsh supermarket lights. It was something else. Something that looked a lot like shame mixed with regret. He started, then stopped. Started again. "Why, how are you here?" It was such a simple question, but loaded with so much meaning. Miss Ellie understood what he was really asking. "How did you end up like this? How did we get here? How did I let this happen?" She could have said so many things in that moment. She could have screamed at him. Could have told him about the 5 years of struggling since he let her go with just 2 weeks severance. Could have described the tiny apartment with the broken heater. Could have explained about the arthritis that made cleaning houses too painful now, about the job applications that went nowhere because she was too old, about the nights she went to bed hungry so she could pay rent. But Miss Ellie had never been one for dramatics. So she said the simplest, most honest thing. "I came to buy groceries, sir. That's all." The crowd murmured. Someone whispered, "That's heartbreaking." Another voice said, "He should be ashamed." Jonathan's little boy, the one who'd started this whole thing, suddenly pulled free from his father's hand and walked right up to Miss Ellie. He looked up at her with those big, trusting eyes that children have before the world teaches them to be suspicious. "Miss Ellie," the boy said softly, "I still remember the songs you sang. The one about the mockingbird." Miss Ellie's face crumpled. She knelt down slowly, her old knees protesting, until she was at eye level with the child. "Hello, sweet boy," she whispered. "You've gotten so big." And that moment, that simple, tender moment between an old woman and a child who remembered her kindness, was what finally broke Jonathan Reed completely. He suddenly strode forward, pulling out his wallet with shaking hands. "Excuse me," he called to the cashier, his voice loud now, commanding. "Everything she removed from her basket, scan it all again. Add more. Add whatever she needs." The cashier blinked in surprise. "Sir, I—" "Do it now," he said, and there was something almost desperate in his voice. Miss Ellie stood up quickly, panic crossing her face. "No, sir, please, I don't need." "Stop," Jonathan said, holding up his hand. "Then, softer, please. Just stop." He turned to face the growing crowd of onlookers. At least 20 people now, all watching, all recording. His face was pale but determined. When he spoke, his voice carried across the entire front of the store. "This woman," he began, pointing to Miss Ellie, "is not a stranger to me. She's not just someone who worked for my family." He paused, his throat working. "She raised my children when I was too busy building my business to be there. She sat up all night when my oldest had pneumonia. She packed school lunches and tied shoelaces and taught my kids their prayers." Miss Ellie pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face now. Jonathan's voice cracked as he continued. "And when I saw her standing here, struggling to pay for bread." He stopped, overcome. "I pretended I didn't know her. I stood there like a coward and acted like she was invisible." The silence that followed was deafening. Then someone in the crowd started clapping. Slowly at first, then others joined in. But Jonathan held up his hand, stopping them. "Don't applaud me," he said firmly. "I don't deserve it. I'm not the hero of this story." He turned to Miss Ellie, and right there, in front of everyone, this millionaire businessman did something nobody expected. He got down on one knee. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." And the whole world watched as Miss Ellie Washington, the woman who'd been forgotten, finally heard the words she'd needed to hear for 5 long years. Now, you might think that's where the story should end. A public apology, some tears, maybe Jonathan writes her a check and everyone goes home feeling better about themselves. But life isn't that simple, is it? Because sometimes, saying sorry is the easy part. It's what comes after that tests who you really are. Jonathan Reed stood back up, his knees cracking slightly. He wasn't a young man anymore either. He turned to the cashier, who'd been watching the whole scene with her mouth hanging open. "Ring up everything," he said quietly but firmly. "Everything she needs for a month. 2 months." "Sir, I really can't," Miss Ellie started. "You can," Jonathan said, looking at her directly now. "And you will. Because this isn't charity, Miss Ellie. This is me trying to make up for 5 years of silence." The cashier started scanning items quickly. Milk, eggs, chicken, vegetables, rice, pasta, coffee, tea. The total climbed higher and higher. $100, $200, $300. Miss Ellie watched with wide eyes as her little basket became bags and bags of groceries. When it was done, Jonathan pulled out his credit card without even looking at the total. But then he did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He put the card back in his wallet. "Actually," he said slowly, "these groceries are coming home with me. Because so is she." The crowd gasped. Miss Ellie's eyes went wide. "What?" Jonathan turned to her, and there was something new in his face now. Not just guilt or shame, but determination. Purpose. Like a man who'd finally figured out what he needed to do. "Come home with me, Miss Ellie," he said. "Not as an employee. As family." Miss Ellie shook her head quickly, panic rising in her chest. "No, sir, I couldn't possibly." "Why not?" Jonathan asked. "That house has 7 bedrooms. You practically built that home with your own hands, cleaning it, caring for it, filling it with love when my wife and I were too distracted to notice what mattered." His voice grew stronger. "You deserve to live there more than I do." "But your wife," Miss Ellie started. Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Will have to understand that some debts can't be paid with money. They have to be paid with honor." Oh, if only he'd known how true those words would turn out to be. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The bags were loaded into Jonathan's black Mercedes SUV by a helpful stock boy who'd been watching the whole thing. Miss Ellie sat in the back seat, her hands folded in her lap, still trembling. She kept thinking this was a dream. That any moment she'd wake up in her cold apartment and realize none of this had happened. Jonathan's son, little Timothy, climbed in next to her and took her hand. "Are you coming to live with us, Miss Ellie?" he asked with that pure, uncomplicated joy that only children possess. I don't know, sweetheart," Miss Ellie said honestly. "I hope so," Timothy said. "Mommy's always angry. But you were never angry. You were always singing." Those words hung in the air like a warning nobody heard. The drive to the Reed mansion took 25 minutes through Chicago traffic. Miss Ellie watched the neighborhoods change through the car window. From the crowded streets where she lived to the tree-lined avenues with big houses set far back from the road. Houses with gates. Houses with security cameras. Houses where people like her usually only entered through the back door. When they pulled up to the Reed estate, Miss Ellie's heart sank. She'd forgotten how big it was. How imposing. The iron gates stood 12 feet high, painted black, with gold accents that caught the afternoon sun. A camera swiveled to track their approach. Jonathan pressed a button on his visor. "It's me," he said into the intercom. "Open the gate." There was a pause. Too long of a pause. "Sir," came a nervous voice through the speaker. Mrs. Reed gave specific instructions. "She said." "I don't care what she said," Jonathan interrupted, his voice hard. "This is my home. Open the gate." Another pause. "Sir, she's watching the security feed right now. She says if you bring that woman inside, there will be consequences." Miss Ellie grabbed the door handle. "Please," she said quickly. "Just let me out. I'll take the bus. I'll be fine. This is too much trouble." "No," Jonathan said firmly. He looked at the camera directly. "Tell my wife that Miss Eleanor Washington is entering this house today. And if she has a problem with that, she can discuss it with me face to face." The gate stayed closed for another long, terrible moment. Then, slowly, it began to swing open with a mechanical whir. But as they drove through, Miss Ellie saw something that made her blood run cold. Standing on the front steps of the mansion was Victoria Reed, Jonathan's wife. And the look on her face wasn't just anger. It was pure, cold fury. Victoria Reed was everything Miss Ellie wasn't. Tall, elegant, dressed in designer clothes that probably cost more than a car. Her hair was perfect. Her makeup was perfect. Everything about her screamed money and power and control. And right now, all of that control was being threatened. "Stay in the car," Jonathan said quietly to Miss Ellie. "Sir, please," Miss Ellie begged. "I don't want to cause problems in your marriage." Jonathan looked at her with sad eyes. "Miss Ellie," he said gently, "the problems in my marriage started long before today. They just haven't been addressed." He opened his door. "Wait here. I'll handle this." But as Jonathan stepped out of the car and walked toward his wife, Miss Ellie knew with absolute certainty that handling this was going to be a lot harder than he thought. Because Victoria Reed wasn't the type of woman to just step aside and let someone she considered beneath her walk into her home. Not without a fight. And Victoria Reed had never lost a fight in her life. Through the car window, Miss Ellie watched as Jonathan and Victoria began talking. Talking quickly became raised voices. Raised voices became shouting. Timothy pressed against Miss Ellie's side, frightened. "It's okay, baby," Miss Ellie whispered, though she didn't believe it herself. "Everything's going to be okay." But as Victoria Reed's voice rose to a shriek that could be heard even inside the car, Miss Ellie knew that nothing was going to be okay. In fact, things were about to get much, much worse. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew a storm was coming? Where you could feel it in the air, that electric tension right before the thunder cracks? That's what it felt like sitting in that car, watching Jonathan and Victoria Reed tear into each other on the front steps of their mansion. Victoria's voice carried clearly now. "You humiliate me in public, and now you bring her here? To my home." "Our home," Jonathan shot back. "And yes, I did. Because it's the right thing to do." "Right thing." Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in it. It was sharp, bitter, dangerous. The right thing would have been remembering who pays for this house, who maintains your reputation, who hosts the parties that keep your business connections alive. Miss Ellie couldn't hear Jonathan's response, but she saw his shoulders stiffen. Timothy tugged at her sleeve. "Miss Ellie, I'm scared." "I know, honey. Me too," Miss Ellie admitted. She'd never lied to children, and she wasn't about to start now. That's when the front door of the mansion opened again, and someone else stepped out. A man Miss Ellie hadn't seen in 5 years. Her heart nearly stopped. It was Gerald Thompson, the Reed family's former driver. He was older now, grayer, but she'd know that face anywhere. He'd been there during her last days at the Reed house. He'd been the one who'd driven her away when Victoria fired her, with her few belongings stuffed into 2 trash bags because Victoria wouldn't even give her proper boxes. Gerald's eyes locked onto the car, onto Miss Ellie's face behind the glass. His expression was complicated: surprise, concern, and something else. Something that looked like relief. He walked down the steps and approached Jonathan, speaking urgently. Miss Ellie couldn't hear the words, but she saw Jonathan's face change. Saw confusion, then shock, then something that looked like growing horror. Whatever Gerald was saying, it was important. It was big. Victoria saw it too. Her face went pale. "Gerald, get back inside," she commanded sharply. But Gerald ignored her, something Miss Ellie had never seen him do before. He kept talking to Jonathan, gesturing, explaining something. And with each word, Jonathan seemed to age 10 years. Finally, Jonathan turned to look at the car. Looked directly at Miss Ellie. His eyes were full of questions now. Questions and something else. Betrayal? Confusion? She couldn't tell. He walked back to the car and opened the door. "Miss Ellie," he said quietly, "I need you to come inside. Please." "Sir, I really think I should just—" "Please," Jonathan repeated, and there was something desperate in his voice now. "Gerald says, he says there are things I need to know. Things from before. And he says you're the only other person who knows the truth." Miss Ellie's stomach dropped. Oh no. Oh no, no, no. She'd promised herself she would never speak of it. Never. It was the one secret she'd locked away so deep that she'd almost convinced herself it hadn't happened. But looking at Jonathan's face, at Gerald standing there with his jaw set in determination, she knew the truth was coming out whether she wanted it to or not. "All right," she whispered. "I'll come." Timothy held her hand as they walked into the house together. The mansion looked exactly as she remembered it. Marble floors. Crystal chandeliers. Art on the walls that cost more than most people earned in a year. But something about it felt different now. Colder. Like a beautiful tomb. Victoria stood in the center of the grand foyer, her arms crossed, her face a mask of barely controlled rage. "This is absurd," she said. "Jonathan, send her away. Now." "Not until I understand what's happening," Jonathan said firmly. He turned to Gerald. "Start from the beginning." Gerald took a deep breath. His hands were shaking. "Sir, do you remember 7 years ago? When your oldest son, Christopher, was 3 years old?" Jonathan's face went still. "Of course. That was the year he got sick. The year he—" His voice caught. "The year he died." The words hung in the air like poison. Miss Ellie felt her knees go weak. Timothy looked up at her, confused. "I have a brother," he asked. Victoria moved suddenly, stepping toward Gerald. "Don't you dare," she hissed. But Gerald stood his ground. "Sir," he said, looking Jonathan directly in the eye, "your son didn't die." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the air seemed to stop moving. "What?" Jonathan's voice came out strangled. "He didn't die," Gerald repeated. "Mrs. Reed told you he died from pneumonia." But that wasn't true. Victoria's face had gone from pale to ghostly white. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice wavered. Jonathan turned to his wife slowly. "Victoria." Gerald continued, his voice growing stronger now. "That night, sir, you were in New York for a business conference. Mrs. Reed was supposed to be watching Christopher, but she was distracted. On a phone call. The boy wandered to the stairs. Miss Ellie closed her eyes. She'd seen it all. Heard the terrible sound. He fell, Gerald said simply. Fell all the way down the main staircase. Jonathan made a sound like he'd been punched in the stomach. Mrs. Reed panicked, Gerald continued. She knew you'd blame her. So she called me. Told me to drive them to a private clinic, one that wouldn't ask questions, wouldn't keep records. That's not, Victoria started. The boy survived, Gerald said, speaking over her. But barely. He needed long-term care. Rehabilitation. Mrs. Reed told you he'd died to cover up what happened. And then. He paused, swallowing hard. Then she sent him away. Sent him where? Jonathan's voice was barely audible. Victoria suddenly crumpled, all her elegant composure shattering. I did what I had to do, she whispered. I couldn't let you know. You would have left me. You would have taken everything. Jonathan stared at her like she was a stranger. Where is my son? Miss Ellie finally spoke, her voice shaking but clear. I can tell you where he went, she said quietly. Because I followed the ambulance that night. I couldn't let him be alone. Everyone turned to look at her. I've been visiting him, Miss Ellie admitted, tears streaming down her face. Every month for 7 years. At the K facility upstate. I told them I was his grandmother. It was the only way they'd let me see him. Jonathan's legs seemed to give out. He sat down hard on the marble floor, his head in his hands. He asks about you, Miss Ellie continued softly. About his daddy. I tell him stories. I tell him you love him, even though he doesn't remember you. And that's when Jonathan Reed, the millionaire businessman, the powerful man who commanded boardrooms and closed million-dollar deals, began to cry. Not quiet tears, but great, gasping sobs that shook his entire body. Because he'd just learned that his son was alive. And that he'd missed 7 years of his life. You know what's amazing about truth? Even when it hurts, even when it tears your whole world apart, there's something clean about it. Something that lets healing finally begin. That's what happened in the Reed mansion that afternoon, as years of lies finally came crumbling down. Jonathan sat on that marble floor for a long time, crying. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even Victoria stayed frozen in place, watching her carefully constructed world collapse around her. Finally, Jonathan looked up. His eyes were red, his face was wet, but there was something new there too. Clarity. Purpose. What's his name? He asked Miss Ellie. Does he still go by Christopher? He does, Miss Ellie said gently. And he's doing well, considering. The doctors say he'll never fully recover from the brain injury, but he can walk now. He can talk. He loves to draw. Jonathan's breath hitched. He draws. Birds mostly, Miss Ellie said with a small smile. All kinds of birds. The nurses say he has real talent. Timothy spoke up suddenly, his small voice cutting through the tension. I want to meet my brother, he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Jonathan looked at his younger son, and something shifted in his face. He stood up slowly, wiping his eyes. Then he did something that surprised everyone. He walked over to Miss Ellie and took both her hands in his. You kept my son alive, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Not just physically, but in every way that matters. You visited him. You told him stories. You made sure he knew he was loved. He paused, his throat working. You did what I should have done. What his own mother should have done. Victoria made a sound, but Jonathan held up a hand without even looking at her. From this day forward, Jonathan said, speaking clearly and firmly, you are not a guest in this house, Miss Ellie. This is your home. For as long as you want it to be. Rent-free. No duties. No obligations. Just family. Miss Ellie shook her head, overwhelmed. Sir, I can't. You can, Jonathan said. And you will, because I'm not giving you a choice. He smiled slightly. Consider it payback for all those times you made me eat vegetables when I tried to skip them. Despite everything, Miss Ellie laughed. It was watery and weak, but it was real. Jonathan turned to Victoria. His face was calm now, but there was steel underneath. We need to talk, he said quietly. Alone. Victoria nodded mutely. Gerald, Jonathan said, would you mind showing Miss Ellie to the guest suite? The blue room. The one with the garden view. Gerald nodded, relief visible on his face. Of course, sir. As Miss Ellie and Gerald walked up the grand staircase, with Timothy holding her hand and chattering excitedly about showing her his room, she heard Jonathan and Victoria's voices rising behind her. But this time, she didn't feel guilty. This wasn't her fault. This was years of deception finally being dealt with. The blue room was beautiful. Too beautiful. Miss Ellie sat on the edge of the four-poster bed and stared at the fancy curtains, the plush carpet, the artwork on the walls. This doesn't feel real, she whispered to Gerald, who'd lingered in the doorway. It's real, Gerald assured her. And it's deserved. He paused. I should have spoken up years ago. I'm sorry. We were both scared, Miss Ellie said. She's a powerful woman. Gerald corrected gently. I think her power just ran out. He was right. 2 hours later, as the sun set over Chicago, Victoria Reed left the mansion with 3 suitcases and a lawyer on speed dial. The divorce would be messy, everyone knew that. But Jonathan didn't seem to care. Instead, he came to Miss Ellie's room and knocked softly. Can we go see him? He asked. Christopher. Can we go now? Miss Ellie looked at the clock. It was almost 7 in the evening. The facility allows visits until 9, she said. If we leave now. Let's go, Jonathan said immediately. The drive upstate took an hour. Jonathan drove himself, with Miss Ellie in the passenger seat and Timothy in the back, too excited to sleep despite the late hour. They talked the whole way, Miss Ellie telling stories about Christopher, about the drawings he made, about the nurses who loved him, about the way he always asked about his family. When they arrived at Riverside K facility, the night nurse recognized Miss Ellie immediately. Miss Ellie, we weren't expecting you until next week. Then she noticed Jonathan and Timothy. This is Christopher's father, Miss Ellie said simply. And his brother. The nurse's eyes went wide. Then she smiled. He's going to be so happy. He's in the art room. Follow me. They walked down quiet hallways lit with soft lighting. Through a doorway, Miss Ellie could see him. Christopher. 10 years old now, with dark hair like his father's and those same deep brown eyes. He sat at a table, carefully coloring a picture of a cardinal. Christopher, the nurse called gently. You have visitors. The boy looked up. His eyes found Miss Ellie first, and his whole face lit up. Grandma Ellie, he called out, using the name he'd given her. But then he saw Jonathan, and something flickered in his eyes. Recognition. Maybe not of the man, but of something deeper. Some connection that DNA and blood remember even when memory doesn't. Hi, Christopher said shyly. Jonathan couldn't speak. He walked forward slowly, like a man approaching something holy and fragile. Then he knelt down in front of the table, bringing himself to his son's eye level. Hi, Christopher, he said, his voice breaking. I'm your dad. And I'm so sorry it took me this long to find you. Christopher tilted his head, studying Jonathan's face. Then he looked at Miss Ellie. Is he really my daddy? He asked. Yes, sweetheart, Miss Ellie said, tears streaming down her face. He really is. Christopher thought about this for a moment. Then he picked up his drawing of the cardinal and held it out to Jonathan. You can have this, he said. Grandma Ellie says cardinals are special. They mean someone who loved you is watching over you. Jonathan took the drawing with shaking hands. And as he looked at his son's artwork, at the careful way each feather was colored, at the love that went into every detail, he broke down completely. I'm here now, he whispered, pulling Christopher into a gentle hug. I'm here, and I'm never leaving again. Timothy came forward shyly and took Christopher's hand. I'm your brother, he said. Want to draw together? And just like that, simply and purely, the family began to heal. 3 months later, Christopher moved into the Reed mansion. His room was next to Miss Ellie's, filled with art supplies and bird books and everything a 10-year-old boy could want. Jonathan had hired the best therapists, the best doctors, the best teachers. But most importantly, he was there. Every morning at breakfast. Every evening for dinner. Every weekend for family time. Miss Ellie watched it all unfold from her comfortable chair in the garden, where she spent her mornings now, drinking good coffee and reading books she'd never had time for before. She'd put on some healthy weight. Her hands didn't shake anymore. And when she smiled, it reached her eyes. One afternoon, Jonathan came and sat beside her. I've been thinking, he said quietly. About that day in the supermarket. Yes, Miss Ellie said. What if I'd kept walking? Jonathan asked. What if Timothy hadn't recognized you? I would have lost everything that matters. Miss Ellie patted his hand gently. But he did recognize me, she said. Because children remember love, even when adults forget. That's the lesson in all this. Jonathan nodded slowly. I won't forget again, he promised. I know you won't, Miss Ellie said. And she was right. Because some lessons, the ones that break your heart before they heal it, those are the ones that stick with you forever. The woman who had raised them all had finally come home. Not to work, not to serve, but to be loved. To be honored. To be family. And in the end, that's what redemption looks like. Not grand gestures or public apologies, though those matter too. But in the quiet moments. In morning coffee and bedtime stories. In remembering that the people who love us when we're small deserve to be loved when they are old. Miss Eleanor Washington never wanted much from life. Just to be remembered. Just to matter. And now, surrounded by the children she'd helped raise and the man who'd finally understood what she'd given, she had both. Sometimes, the story doesn't end with the grand gesture. Sometimes it ends in a garden, with good coffee, surrounded by people who finally understand what love really looks like. And that's the best ending of all.